Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Kalik, and this is Dispatches. Ethiopia has been in the headlines in recent months as the TPLF, a Tigrayan separatist group that ruled the country for 3 decades until 2018, violently seized the northern Ethiopian state of Tigray from the government. As of this recording, the Ethiopian government had declared a ceasefire. However, the TPLF has continued to fight to expand its control over Tigray's border areas and is threatening to push the war into neighboring countries. The Western media has largely cheered on the TPLF and demonized the Ethiopian government and its allies with allegations of ethnic cleansing, intentional famine, and even genocide. The U.S. has gone so far as to place sanctions on the Ethiopian government, a longtime U.S. ally. But as is usually the case with most wars in geostrategic areas of the world, there's far more to the story than is being told, and a whole lot of misleading information from the mainstream press. To help us make sense of what's happening and how we got here, I'm joined by Eugene Puryear, journalist with Breakthrough News and host of The Punch-Out, which everyone, of course, should listen to. Eugene, welcome.
Well, Rania, thank you so much for having me. This is a critically important issue, and I appreciate you being willing to dive into it.
I'm really excited to get into it, but first, I just want to remind those who are watching to hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit the bell so you get notifications. And also just a reminder that you can listen to every episode of Rania Kalik Dispatches anywhere you get podcasts. And for those who are listening, you can watch every episode on the Breakthrough News YouTube page. So make sure you follow and subscribe. Now to the topic at hand. Eugene, there's so much to cover with a story like this because most people, most Americans, I should say, are largely ignorant of this region of the world. So I want to break it down on a very basic level. And for those unfamiliar with the African continent, which again is to most Westerners, Ethiopia is Africa's second most populous country with around 114 million people, just to give people an idea of the importance of the country that we're talking about. And it's located in the Horn of Africa. It borders several countries: Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea, Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya. And Ethiopia has actually been one of the largest recipients of U.S. aid in sub-Saharan Africa. So I just wanted to give some of that background before we get into the issue of the TPLF. Now, the TPLF is based in the Ethiopian state of Tigray. And in most Western media coverage, as I mentioned, the TPLF has been depicted as these, noble rebels struggling for freedom in their region and for their ethnic group. But the Ethiopian government has labeled them a terrorist group and accused the U.S. of unacceptable and inappropriate meddling when it comes to this issue. So, Eugene, let's start with that. Let's start with the TPLF. What is the TPLF? What has been their role in Ethiopia? And moreover, what has been Ethiopia's role on the continent of Africa under the TPLF's control?
Well, I think this is a critically important question, Rania, principally because almost everything that is being accused of the Ethiopian government currently were widespread allegations, and certainly ones that were much better documented, about the government of Ethiopia under the TPLF. But to take a step back to answer your question, so the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front emerged out of what you could say maybe the revolutionary ferment in the country of Ethiopia that followed the fall of Emperor Haile Selassie. Now, for many people who don't know, and this is really important and critical context for the whole Ethiopian issue, Ethiopia, going far back into antiquity, is one of the oldest empires on the planet. And there is a lot to be said about that. I won't get into it all here. But the point being is that the ruling family, the royal family, was from one ethnic group, the Amhara. And there are many, many ethnic groups all across Ethiopia. And so for years and years and years, there was, hundreds of years, thousands of years, a deep oppression for many of the various ethnicities that were not Amhara. So in the middle 1970s, you have the collapse of the Haile Selassie royal dictatorship, if you will, in what was a massive famine at the time that really brought to a head a number of different issues, including issues of ethnic identity and national unity, and so on and so forth. And so in this process, there were many people of all ethnicities inside of Ethiopia, also outside in the diaspora, who were revolutionaries of some form or another, at least claimed to be revolutionaries of some form or another. So the TPLF is rooted in a movement, primarily student-based initially, of people who returned to the country during this revolutionary ferment, the immediate days of it, went into the Tigrayan countryside as part of a broader land reform policy that was going on at the time, where the immediate post-revolutionary government took a number of people who were coming back to the country who had revolutionary ideas and saying, we're going to do this massive land reform. Of course, there'd been feudalism, of course, for hundreds and hundreds of years. And we need you to go out and to help administer this new form of living, essentially, the redivision of the lands in a communal way, essentially. So taking it away from sort of a feudal landowner space and reorganizing it in more of a collective cooperative space. Now, again, there's quite a bit that could be said about that prospect, but I don't want to get too detained by that, although we can talk more about that history. But the point being is that the TPLF emerged from forces who were in Tigray. They were, of course, Tigrayan people, and they were hostile, or they became hostile to the central government, the socialist government, the so-called Derg in Ethiopia in the late 1970s, especially in the 1980s. They wanted to have what they said were different policies, but it was heavily based on issues of feeling that they wanted to end the marginalization of the Tigrayan people. Now, there are certainly, I would in many ways say that that's not really the whole story, and that in many ways they were using this issue of ethnic marginalization in a way that I find to be opportunistic in terms of the policies of the Derg government, the socialist government at the time. But just to give people a sense, this is what they were saying. This is how they emerged. They said, we're a Marxist rebel group, so we're not anti-socialist. They had some Maoist phraseology around them and some roots, and they're fighting for the autonomy of the Tigrayan people and more broadly against this authoritarian regime in the center. That at least was the way they put it. Now, I say at least because they were the most powerful of all the various rebel groups that existed in Ethiopia during the socialist regime. So when that regime fell in 1991, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front was able to come to power at the head of what was a broader coalition of different forces. But they were by far the center of it and by far the strongest force. Now, you would think if they had spent a decade and a half, or whatever it had been, fighting for liberation, for freedom of oppressed national minorities all across Ethiopia against this authoritarian Soviet-backed government, you would think that the first thing they would do would be to reverse some of these trends. But instead, what they did is they took almost all the power into themselves and became almost sort of Tigrayan supremacist in terms of the type of line that they were pushing, where unlike what they claimed they were doing, which was going to open up everything to all people and be very different, they really just perpetrated something similar to what we had seen over the years, which was one ethnic group being particularly dominant and taking it out on other ethnic groups in terms of their ability to have power plays. They certainly were not in favor of any major federalism. They heavily cracked down on a range of different people. And this is where the issue I raised at the beginning of the, quote unquote, human rights abuses come into play. I mean, certainly in 2005, for instance, they were widely accused in the Gabela region of conducting massive massacres of all sorts, using rape as a weapon, forced displacements of people. This is also something they were known for in the lower Omo Valley, where they displaced tens of thousands of people in order to put massive sugar plantations there that were for extractive agriculture. They have been accused many, many different times, credibly accused they were, and really proven to have shot live ammunition all the time into peaceful protests of all types. Every election, they were winning by 99%. So the elections were widely recognized to be essentially fraudulent, at least fraudulent in the sense that they weren't really having support of 99% of the people. That's and, you could go on and talking about all of these different elements and all of these different pieces, but that was their reputation in the African continent. That was their reputation internationally. Interestingly enough, many of the people criticizing the current Ethiopian regime the hardest and really saying almost nothing about the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, or now the Tigrayan Defense Forces, were in fact the leading voices saying that this is an extremely undemocratic government, that they are abusing their power in every single way, that they are using all of the worst types of torture and massacres and other pieces like that to keep their rule totally in place. They also were heavily manipulating aid that was coming into the country, basically saying, if you don't get down with us, then we will not give you, the aid that has come in from international aid agencies. I didn't mention the Ogaden region of Ethiopia, where they were also widely seen as conducting, many atrocities and human rights violations. And on top of all of that, in 2007, they conspired with the United States in order to invade Somalia and destabilize Somalia, which had no central government at all from 1991 to 2005. The Islamic Courts Union came together, which brought together a relatively wide swath of clan leaders and others in Somalia, first unified government in more than a decade. Since 1991, there had been a brutal civil war. The country had totally collapsed. And Ethiopia and the United States decided they did not like the Islamic Courts Union for a range of reasons. The Ethiopians, with the backing of the United States, invaded, destabilized Somalia again. And we look at Somalia right now in terms of the country being essentially still in a state of complete and total collapse, massive warfare, and so on and so forth. So I know I said a lot there, but I think the bottom line really is the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, as the leaders of Ethiopia from 1991 to 2018, were widely believed and proven, really, in many ways, to be one of the worst human rights abusers, certainly in the African continent, probably in the world, and in almost every single way, from rigging elections to shooting down protesters to using rape as a weapon, using food as a weapon, using forced displacement as a form of social control. This was everything that they were doing. They also started a war with, well, some people might say who started it, but nevertheless, they also ramped up the military action between Eritrea and Ethiopia, fought 2 wars with them. And so really their entire orientation was to seize as much power for, I don't even want to say Tigrayan people, really, because I think that would be a misnomer, but for the clique of Tigrayans who were with the TPLF, they were also known as being very corrupt, seizing as much power for them as they possibly could, imposing that power on the other ethnic groups of Ethiopia, and using the most brutal circumstances they possibly could to make that happen.
No, I'm so happy you delved into that, because if you read any mainstream media report right now about the issue of what's happening in Tigray, you really are given they paint this image of a rebel group that's just fighting for their minority ethnicity to have rights or something. They don't tell you they were actually, the TPLF was in charge, was in charge in this coalition for 30 years and was actually voted out. I mean, so that's what happened. So can you give our listeners and viewers an idea of who the prime minister is now and why he has earned the ire of America before we get into this recent conflict? Because he's become, he's at the center of all this now, as he's being very demonized, even though he won a Nobel Peace Prize. So tell us what happened in 2018 with the TPLF and this new prime minister coming into power.
Well, the current Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, actually comes from the coalition that the TPLF had as their sort of governing fig leaf, if you will. And what happened in 2018 is there was a rising tide of resistance in the country. So all of the things I just mentioned had started to add up. There was, and actually continues to be, an insurgency in Oromia, the Oromo area, and that is the ethnicity of Abiy Ahmed, that was getting very hot, getting very serious. And plus, there was just generally quite a bit of discontent across many different forces inside of Ethiopia. So the TPLF regime sort of unraveled, really. And inside of their own coalition, there were many people who felt like this is totally untenable. There's no way that we can move forward. Their style of rule is in and of itself so brutal and has disaffected so many people. There's no way that we can continue on this front. And Abiy Ahmed was actually voted in to become the prime minister out of that coalition of people when the TPLF was essentially displaced, right? I mean, that's more or less what happened, is that their role in the ruling coalition was sidelined by their own coalition partners who felt that their policies have been too brutal to continue in any way, shape, or form similar to what had happened. And they were more or less relegated to a minor role. Abiy Ahmed becomes the prime minister. The first thing he starts to do is he releases thousands of political prisoners. He changes the laws around many of the sort of national security laws and pieces like that have been used by the TPLF to push forward their persecution of different individuals. He starts to change those laws, bring in new laws. They put a political prisoner in charge of the State Human Rights Commission to try to make that more of a real commission. They move towards a peace with Eritrea, which is a long-running issue in Ethiopia, going way back to the collapse of the Haile Selassie, whatever you want to call it. Some will call it monarchy. I think it should be called correctly a dictatorship. But that being said, the collapse of that empire in the revolutionary ferment of the 70s, the issue of Eritrea and Eritreans wanting to be an independent country, which also has a lot to it, but long-standing dissension, wars happening in the 80s, in the 90s, in the early 2000s. So Abiy Ahmed starts to really offers a olive branch to Eritrea, and they're able to sign this peace deal, which is a huge deal. There is a lot of things that are still going on in the Oromo area and other places, but they signed deals with some of the armed groups that had been fighting against the government, and of course allowed some of their exiles to return to the country. And so really, this is why Abiy Ahmed wins the Nobel Peace Prize about a year after he comes in, because he was seen as someone who, I mean, I think most of the world, myself included, who follow the horn, were relatively shocked with how quickly he seemed to be moving to bring back exiles, to free people from prison, to reform the laws inside of the country, and seemingly to want to move forward in a very different modality than what we had seen under the TPLF. So, you know, since that time and since this war, quite a bit has happened. Now, there is, and maybe people are getting this at this point, but really the root issue in Ethiopia that is so controversial is when you take a country that is the fruit of, you know, one of the oldest empires on earth, but like all other empires involves significant historical oppression of national minority groups of all types. How do you have an equitable setup where everyone feels that they have a role and that they are not marginalized in the way that they have been in the past? How do you distribute the resources in a way that reflects that? How do you distribute the political power in a way that reflects that? What is the best way to do that? Is it a form of federalism? Is it a multinational centralized government? And so on and so forth. So what Abiy Ahmed has been pushing forward really is that there should be, and you know, he changed the name of the political party that he represented, which was sort of the remnants, if you will, of the former TPLF-led coalition, to the Prosperity Party, and is essentially been promoting something that's more of a centralized vision, but a multinational centralized vision, that we need a central government for all the reasons that that's important, that's a strong center in terms of economic development, which is a major theme of Abiy Ahmed, but to be fair, was also a major theme of about the past 3 Ethiopian governments. But be that as it may, that we should sort of all come together, that we shouldn't fragment the country. But there is a lot of dissension about how that works and what it really means. And does it elevate another ethnicity over your ethnicity? And is it just a replay of what's happened in the past, where they say we're all going to get along, but it's really they get along and you have to step to the side? So there's a lot of questions about how that's done. But that has really been the hallmark of Abiy Ahmed and how he's come forward is we need to resolve all these historical conflicts, but the way to resolve them is through economic development and a centralized multinational government that is able to spread the wealth around, if you will, to a much better degree than has happened in the past. Now, I say there are others who certainly think that that's not the best way to do it. Certainly the TPLF government is extremely hostile to that vision. And it's relatively obvious why they're hostile to that vision, because it means that they are sidelined in a big way. So, you know, and we can talk about what started this conflict, but what's important to note is, you know, even the New York Times, in one of their recent pieces that was, of course, ripping the Ethiopian government, noted that up until this conflict, it wasn't even clear if the TPLF leadership had the support of the majority of people in Tigray, much less anywhere else in the country, where they, of course, were extremely unpopular and have been totally sidelined. So you go from the ruling party that's so brutal, so corrupt, so inequitable in terms of how they distribute the fruits of economic development. You're sidelined by your own allies. And then in your own region, it seems that you might not be able to get a majority of support. Then you can see right there that for them, a federalized vision and the need to have power in Tigray as their sort of power base becomes crucial for their ability to have a foothold in the governing infrastructure of Ethiopia. And that's sort of, I think, what brings us to this current moment. But that's who Abiy Ahmed is, and that's, you know, more or less the direction he's been pushing things. And of course, that's led to other complicated issues like the dam issue that has become a major issue with Ethiopia and Sudan, which is heavily linked to his visions of how there can and should be economic development in Ethiopia and what that means for the region. So there's a lot of different pieces, and I don't want people to think that there's like, you know, it's not a black hat, white hat situation. Right. And there are certainly legitimate criticisms of what Abiy Ahmed was doing, but it's only fair to note that he had, by all accounts, and I'm talking the people criticizing him now, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the US government, all these people, he was making big strides in terms of the issues that the TPLF had been heavily criticized for around human rights abuses and atrocities. And I think it's interesting that all of that history seems to be totally forgotten in the conversation about what's going on right now, even though most of it is just from 2 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect, and we'll get into this in a little bit, and I suspect a lot of that has to do with a lot of these human rights organizations being soft power arms of the U.S. and jumping on what U.S. policy is here, and that is to be very antagonistic towards a lot of the vision that you just laid out. Especially, like, I think, you know, with making peace with Eritrea, it kind of sets a precedent for maybe not being the U.S.'s police in the Horn of Africa. But we can get into that. First, I do want to, you know, as important as everything you said is, I do think it's important also to note who did start this. Because looking back to, last November when the fighting began, the mainstream outlets, like The Guardian, the New York Times, all of these outlets who were covering it were pretty explicit in saying that it was the TPLF that initiated this conflict by attacking Ethiopian military outposts or an outpost. But since then, the timeline has become much murkier. And if you're reading to try to keep up with this conflict, it's actually hard to tell who started it. Sometimes it's even portrayed as if the Ethiopian government started it. So can you talk a bit about that? How did this conflict start? And is it based on what you were just laying out? Why did the TPLF initially engage in hostilities with these Ethiopian military outposts?
Well, I think that's a great point because without a doubt, the TPLF started the war. They themselves have in no way, shape, or form denied that. They have had spokespeople saying that it was a preemptive assault. And in fact, one who even compared it to Israel's wars against various Arab nations. So it gives you a little bit of a sense of where they're coming from there. And what it really all came down to was a power play. So there were supposed to be elections in 2020. In the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and like many other countries around the world, the Ethiopian government decided that they were going to postpone these elections. Now, the TPLF, who prior to this had also been doing things like having military parades and, reaching out to international forces and, sharing their discontent with the government. So, really laying the basis for taking some sort of action, said that they felt that this was totally unfair, that this was totally authoritarian on the part of the Abiy Ahmed government. And they accused them of just trying to stop the elections because they were going to lose and they didn't want to be seen as, not having a democratic mandate or whatever it may be. And so they said, we're going to go ahead and we're going to hold elections anyway. We're just going to do it in the region of Tigray. We're going to hold these elections. Now, also, just to remind people now, this is not me, the New York Times, which has been very pro-Tigrayan People's Liberation Front so far, said, up until this time, it was unclear if the majority of people even supported the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. So I say that to say, so they've decided to move forward with this regional election, which I believe they won by 98%. But it's important to note that two other forces, significant political forces in Tigray, had boycotted the election. So there's that. And this was just sort of a regional election. We don't know exactly how many people voted, what went, or whatever. It's not to say that there's no support for the TPLF in Tigray. There's obviously quite a bit of support for them, both historically and contemporarily. But it certainly didn't seem like it was 98% of the vote. So they have this illegal regional election against the central government that they claim that they're fighting for sovereignty, independence, freedom, or whatever it may be. And this obviously became a major issue for the central government there in Ethiopia. They took some measures to address this issue. The TPLF then decides to launch an armed military uprising. They do a fair amount of shelling. They seize a major military base. They take all of the heavy weapons they can find, and then they launch this war against the Ethiopian government in the Tigray region, right? The Ethiopian military and the other people who are there. And then the Ethiopian military responds. The Eritrean military gets involved at the request of Ethiopia. At least that's the way it's presented. And I don't see any reason to say that that's not the case. And we end up in the current conflagration. But I think it is important to really understand how the thing began. It really began as a power play. It began as a power play by the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front to try to create the broader context for which they are seen as the legitimate force in that region and for which they are seen as the people who should rightfully be ruling it. But it was not defensive. It was by their own admission offensive. It is related primarily to the issue of COVID-19. I mean, I'm not in the hearts and the minds of the Ethiopian government, so I don't know exactly what they were saying, but they weren't the only government in the world that was postponing elections because of COVID-19. So it sounds at least like that in line with what seemed to be good practice in many countries around the world. And because of that pretext, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, that, like I said, have been doing military parades and all these other things, used that as a pretext really to push forward their attempt to get back into the political equation in Ethiopia with some level of leverage and some level of power.
So, before we go on beyond that, I do just want to ask you about the issue of, do we know to what extent this is an inter-communal conflict as opposed to one just between the TPLF and the state? And the reason I ask that is because Ethiopia's political system, which you kind of alluded to, was, as far as I can understand, an ethnic federation with these ethnic-based states. Given the right, which is strange, given the right to secede from the federation. So it seems like this was a recipe that baked conflict into the country and almost guaranteed that something like this could happen or would happen. I mean, doesn't it?
Yes, I think that's very true. I mean, I think like many empires, right? What's the easiest way you keep these massive empires together? Divide and rule. And I don't think Ethiopia is any exception to that issue. And for many hundreds of years, you had the Amhara ethnicity that was the ethnicity of the ruling family, and they weaponized the issue of ethnicity in terms of how they distributed the political and economic rewards. And they did the same with other ethnicities. They, lifting people against each other, pitting people against each other, brutally suppressing all people at different times. I mean, this, like any other empire, was the way that it was operating. And so, yeah, I think this is a very thorny issue. It's a difficult issue to deal with. It's a difficult issue to address because there are, other considerations. I mean, when we're talking about things like poverty alleviation, for instance, having a strong central government that can deploy resources at scale quickly is very beneficial to the issue of poverty alleviation. But obviously it cuts against the grain of federalism. And so how do you have a situation where people who have been sidelined for hundreds of years feel like they're actually included and not just objects, that they're subjects in what's happening? That's complicated. And you can see that right now. I mean, for instance, the so-called Tigrayan Defense Forces, and that in and of itself should tell you something. They changed their name to Tigrayan Defense Forces after starting the war. But if you look at what's happening, right now this week as we're talking, they launched an offensive. So again, an offensive against the forces, militia forces, quote unquote militia forces in the Oromia region, which is the home of the Oromo people. That's Abiy Ahmed's ethnicity. These people are fighting on the side of the government. But there are also armed groups in Oromo that were at one point talking with Abiy Ahmed and the government, and then it didn't really work out, and now they still continue to be in a state of opposition. And so in that one state right there, you have multiple different views of how things should go forward, and I think that is the case in many different parts of Ethiopia. So it's a challenging issue on how these things come together, and it does underlay a lot of the conflict. And so it's definitely inter-communal in the sense that it's hard to have these discussions about what should be happening in the future of Ethiopia without addressing what has been a historic marginalization of many peoples and what has been a very inequitable circumstance for many of these peoples over a certain amount of time. And even when people have pushed policies to try to address these issues, and certainly, there's a lot of criticism of the Derg and the socialist government in the 1980s, but they did try to address these issues. Abiy Ahmed right now is trying in many ways to address these issues, but it's not that simple. I think it's very complicated, and it has to do with a long history of real oppression that many of these peoples have been forced to live with and live among, and different pieces like that. And then you have the issues that arise, with cosmopolitanism and the nature of urbanization and other things like that. And this is not distinct to Ethiopia. I mean, this is a problem that many, many countries have faced for quite some time. I mean, let's talk about the United States. Obviously is an issue where the marginalization of minority, what I would call minority nationalities, Black people here in the United States and others. I mean, it's still very complicated in terms of how you create real equality, real unity, and it can cause many different conflicts. And that's not to make a direct comparison, but I think it's to give people a sense of the fact that these are deep-rooted, hard to resolve issues. And a lot of the questions that seem like economic or whatever in nature really do cut with the grain or against the grain of all these various long-term issues. And even amongst the different ethnicities themselves, there isn't 100% agreement on how to approach it or how to deal with it.
And I want to get into the issue of, beyond Ethiopia in terms of the broader context, the foreign support that may be going into this. But first, I do want to ask you from your perspective or your analysis on, there was this announcement by the Ethiopian government of a unilateral ceasefire. The TPLF, however, has continued fighting. It's, and this ongoing fighting is threatening to spill over into neighboring countries. But it was really shocking, I think, to many to see the Ethiopian army basically lose Tigray. Because the Ethiopian army is one of the most well-armed, well-funded armies on the continent. It's huge. It's a huge country. And from your understanding, how was that possible? How was it possible that the TPLF, which people thought, were going to lose, suddenly sort of had this victory in their state, over their state?
I have to say, I was also surprised. I think the only real answer you could give is that, because it is true, Ethiopia has a large army. It has a historically very well-trained army, and that has roots that go far back several decades. I mean, the only thing I can really say is that a significant part of the army that was good must have been Tigrayan. And over their years of running the country from 1991 to 2018, many of the best fighters must have been contained within their modality. Now, obviously, you know, the Ethiopians have also given as good as they've gotten. And it is worth noting that they were able to retake the region, and then there was sort of a seesaw. So I don't know if it's as, you know, if they're as overmatched as it appears. And I think the Tigrayans have done a great job making the Ethiopians appear as if they are worse fighters than perhaps they really are. And certainly they were driven back as well. But I think that the real answer to that is that a lot of, or the only real answer is that a lot of the military expertise has to have rested within that faction of the former ruling party there, the center party of the ruling regime. And other than that, it's a little difficult to really speak to. And obviously, it seems like a lot of major fighting was done by Eritrea as well, which also has a very strong, very powerful military, and one that is, you know, perhaps much more unified than the Ethiopian military in the context of the broader issue we've seen of the country itself having trouble coming together. I think the military is also indicative of that. But I mean, that's my sort of back of the envelope, but it's tough to know. And there's such a seesaw back and forth in this war, what we've seen so far. I think that it is sort of notable that I think some of it may be actually overplayed about how poorly the Ethiopian military is doing. I mean, certainly they haven't been having the world's most rousing success, but they haven't really been totally routed either, even though that's the way that it's been portrayed. So I don't know. It's tough to say, but those are some of the things that I would put out there.
So, Eugene, it's hard to imagine that a country as large and geostrategically important as Ethiopia would descend into civil war and separatism without any foreign involvement. And we know that the Trump administration had threatened Ethiopia over its refusal to bend to demands that he and Egypt had imposed on them. And we know Egypt is willing to go to war over the Nile and the Ethiopian dam. And we know Sudan is greatly concerned as well. And, you know, here in Lebanon, sources say that the Emiratis are very close to Ethiopia and Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. And Israel has had good and bad relations with various countries in the region, including Egypt, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, as well as Sudan more recently. So, you know, Ethiopia is a major player also in Somalia, where the Qataris and Emiratis are both involved. And I guess my point of all of this is to say, is there any reason to assume that the TPLF escalation was backed by or maybe done in collaboration with an outside power?
You know, it's tough to say whether it was done with direct backing or direct knowledge in terms of what they did, but certainly it was done with the I mean, it has to be. Why would you do something like this knowing the impact it potentially could have on you if you did not have the backing of powerful authorities? And we do know that the TPLF had been having back channel conversations, well, not that back channel, with the European Union and with other forces in the lead up to the conflict. And certainly they have these long, long ties, especially to the United States, especially over the issue of regional foreign policy, in particular the issue of Somalia, that it seems that they at least must have had some feeling that they could expect a certain amount of support from the so-called international community, from the United States, from Europe, and others. Now, they had also been supporting Abiy Ahmed. So the whole thing has a little bit of murkiness to it. And, I can't say for sure, but it does seem that the dam issue, the Grand Renaissance Dam, may have been the triggering issue. Now, as you mentioned during the Trump administration, the Trump administration have been pushing very hard, saying, well, let's go ahead and we're going to help you with the negotiations between Sudan, Egypt, Ethiopia, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, those negotiations broke down because the Trump administration took the side of Egypt 100%. Right. And that was obviously related to, I think, broader strategic reasons. I don't know how much related to Ethiopia it was. I think it was more related to U.S.-Egyptian relations and the role that Egypt plays as, sort of a neo-colonial satrapy for the United States and the broader region. But that does seem to be a trigger for a change, because it seemed like everything was all good between Abiy Ahmed and the U.S. government, more or less. And it does seem that at least one element of why the U.S. government and other international forces have so quickly backed the TPLF offensive, even though it is an offensive, not defensive, despite the fact that they said it, even though they themselves have also been both in the past and currently, by the way, tasked or tagged with human rights abuses of a serious nature, despite the fact that it doesn't seem to be rooted in any sort of plan to improve the country, but potentially just enforces the tearing apart of the country. It seems as if the reason why is that what they're hoping for and what they're calling for, when you look at the US and other people who are saying what they want to do, they're saying there needs to be a negotiated solution. And it seems that this is what the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front either knew ahead of time or expected they could set up with the fait accompli, where what will happen is there'll be a negotiated solution, but the only negotiated solution in terms of what they have put out is if they are allowed to control Tigray, which means that they then get a foothold in the government in a major way. So you have this US, maybe to call them a client is a little extreme, because Ethiopia in many ways, had his level of independence to it. They were coming closer with China and other things like that, but they were very close to the United States. They were a big part of the US war on terror. So they've been a very close ally of the United States in the region and in a much broader sense in the African continent. And, this was also noted, by the way, when Obama went there in 2012 and doubled down on support. Many people were saying, Obama, stop supporting the Zenawi regime, stop supporting who's the prime minister at the time. And he went there and said, no, this is a great democratic government. So it was a big issue. So I think for sure those forces would either be happy to see or are willing to accept a government that would have more of the influence of their historical ally, and in some might say client, somewhere on that spectrum, having them in place. And that really seems to be, when you look at what the TPLF has put out in terms of negotiating positions, that really seems to be the main thing that they're trying to do, is get their leverage back. Because remember, as we talked about earlier, they had been totally marginalized because their rule had been so brutal, so corrupt, that even their own allies basically dumped them to the side, bring in this new guy. He starts making all sorts of changes, including, releasing people they put in prison, bringing people back from abroad that they had forced into exile, opening up the human rights situation. And just to give you a sense of that, the Human Rights Office in Ethiopia, the government-funded one, which right now, by the way, is conducting an investigation with the United Nations into atrocities in this war, they themselves have accused the government that backs them of atrocities in this war. So it gives you a sense of what Abiy Ahmed had really been doing. Again, not everything was perfect, not like everything was the way it should be, but I mean, he put a former political prisoner in the head of a human rights office that during the midst of this war has been willing to openly criticize them and work with the United Nations in order to look more into this. And by the way, the government is saying, no, they're lying. But it just gives you a sense of, the what's been happening in the country. So I say all that just to say that, really going back to it, I think it seems pretty clear to me in the context of the position the United States took vis-a-vis Egypt and the dam, and in the position they've taken in terms of basically the total backing of the TPLF in this war, is that whether they knew about it, whether they endorsed it ahead of time, in this current moment, they're more than happy to have a political dispensation that exists inside of Ethiopia, where people who they know are friendly to the interests of U.S. imperialism would have much more power and much more leverage, and which could weaken Ethiopia by pushing it back into a more federalized kind of state. That, whatever you can say about federalism as a concept, in this context, I think very clearly would make Ethiopia less able to act in a regional way with mass authority in a significant sense. Now, to touch on your other questions that are related to this, there are many other interests that we don't know how they are playing into this. Now, the issue of the UAE is a big issue. They're also known as having good relations with Eritrea. And the context over the last presidential, or really the current conflict happening over how the next president is going to be picked in Somalia, was, many people say, a product of Eritrean and Emirati backing of Farmajo, who is the guy who is in there now and who is trying to not have elections in a way that they're actually now going to have them. It's a little confusing there in Somalia. But nevertheless, the accusations, and I say accusations because this is just what people are saying, it's not necessarily proven, was that the UAE and Eritrea were saying you should not have these elections, that you should govern in a way that is, it's tough to say, in a Western sense, they would say more hard line. But what Farmajo was putting out there was different. He was saying that what they need in Somalia is one person, one vote, but that there's no security situation for that, and that they need to have him basically run the whole thing for another 3 years to establish more stability. So I don't want to get too deep into the issue of Somalia, and I think a lot of that was certainly self-motivated by the issue of Farmajo, but I say that to say it's obvious that there is at least some form of thinking in different countries around the world, including in Africa, about how to resolve the issue of ethnic fracturing, really, and the broader and clan-based fracturing and other sort of warlord-based fracturing in the broader region, and that some people seem to feel that the easiest way to address this is to push maybe more of a of a stronger line in terms of establishing stability. And there's at least some accusation that that's a piece of it. Now, the United States was 100% opposed to Farmajo staying there. And the reason they were opposed to Farmajo staying there, in my belief, and this is what I said consistently on the Punch Out, was that they have promoted a totally fake government in Somalia, the so-called transitional federal government that became the current government since the invasion of 2007. None of these governments are really representative of the Somali people in any significant way. It's basically based on the leadership of powerful clans coming together and choosing who is going to be the leader with the backing of the US government, but they don't even control a significant portion of the country. Somaliland has formed their own country. Puntland, which is another semi-autonomous region, sort of half in, half out. And the rest of the country, which is allegedly controlled by the so-called government, is, anywhere from 20% to 80%, who even knows, on any given day, controlled by al-Shabaab. So, the United States, though, has invested so much into Somalia and claimed that they're backing a democracy. I think that they deeply feared Farmajo staying in power, not because it was less democratic than what they're going to do now, which is have a bunch of clan leaders come together. Sorry, I lost my sound here, but I'm going to keep going because you can keep hearing me, is to have a bunch of clan leaders come together and pick who the next president is going to be in Somalia. Now, that's certainly not any more or less democratic than what Farmajo was proposing, quite frankly, but at least from the point of view of what we consider democracy. But be that as it may, it destroyed the fig leaf of democracy in Somalia, which I think is difficult for the United States because, their whole thing is we support freedom and democracy. They never say what they're actually doing in these countries. What they're actually doing in Somalia is they want to establish a government that they know they can rely on, not to create too much drama in the context of the world's largest, commercial corridor in terms of leading right there into the Suez Canal. So, how that plays into the broader peace in the Horn here, I think is not known, but there are many people who I respect on this issue who have laid out a vision that Eritrea, the Abiy Ahmed government in Ethiopia, and to a lesser extent, the Farmajo forces in Somalia are presenting a different vision for the Horn that would be more geopolitically independent, that would stress unity and economic development over division, and that would approach the issues of fragmentation certainly with maybe a harder line, but one that was aimed at establishing stability, and that inside of this key geostrategic region, the United States does not want to see one country that they absolutely hate, which is Eritrea, and that's another issue. Another country that they maybe are unsure what way they're going, and that's Ethiopia, that because of the issues with the dam and others could be messing with other U.S. client projects in the region, including Egypt, which is very important to U.S. imperialism, and that in Somalia, things could potentially go another way and upset the apple cart of this fig leaf of democracy that they set up. So how all of that is playing into this, I don't know, but it is all playing into it. There's no doubt about that. This is one of the most geostrategically important regions on the planet. It's never talked about like that, but again, just for people to remember what happened when that ship got stuck in the Suez Canal and it completely and totally disrupted all world commerce? Well, think about it like this. The Horn region is right there in that major commercial corridor. So what type of government they have? I mean, of course, they did everything in their power to overthrow the socialist government in the 1980s because they could not have socialists allied with the Soviet Union have any influence in that region. They weren't going to let it happen. And in fact, they backed Somalia in a war at that time in 1977. But again, just taking one step back, I think it's still a little murky how it's all playing in, but I think it does seem clear that something switched in the Ethiopia-U.S. relationship, which had been very close when they decided to take Egypt's position 100% on the issue of the grand dam that they're building there in Ethiopia. And that seems to be related perhaps to a new dispensation with better relations between Ethiopia and Eritrea, what that could potentially mean for the politics of Somalia, and whether or not that sets back the United States in terms of their regional agenda of domination over major commercial corridors and routes, which is obviously a huge piece of U.S. foreign policy writ large in terms of how they, are projecting power.
Well, I think you just laid out there what the U.S. really means whenever it talks about this region, period, is what it actually wants. Those are U.S. interests, which you very clearly spelled out. That said, I do want to play a clip because I think it's an important one. Now, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield, has tried to do something interesting, which I want to get your reaction to. Please. Which she tried to weaponize anti-racism in what I felt was a very odd way to push the UN Security Council to act against Ethiopia. Because, of course, the U.S. has, in its rhetoric and, of course, with its actions by actually placing sanctions on officials in the Ethiopian government, has thrown its support behind its longtime ally, the TPLF. And she said, I'm quoting her. She said, "I ask those who refuse to address this issue publicly, do African lives not matter?" and this is at the Security Council. And then she reiterated it after she had said this in front of the press, as well as a bunch of other U.S. demands for what they want to see out of this conflict. So I want to play that real quick and then get your reaction.
Please.
It's the first opportunity for us to show that African lives matter as much as other lives around the world. But an open meeting is not enough. What we need to see is action on the ground. We need to see a ceasefire that is permanent, that all of the parties agree to. We need to see the Eritrean troops return to their own border. We need to see unfettered access for humanitarian workers. We need to see accountability for the atrocities that have been committed.
So before you do answer, Eugene, I want to hear your thoughts on the way that she oddly tried to like weaponize the Black Lives Matter slogan. That was kind of weird because both sides of this conflict are African. It's not like there's like a white side and a black side. But I'd like to get your thoughts on that, but also for what the U.S. is calling for. What she said sounds so reasonable, but when you actually step outside of the, like, kind of look at the situation objectively, I can't imagine demanding that any country, for example, in the West, submit to the demands of a separatist group that is violently seizing a state. So I just find it odd that it's being phrased that way in terms of Ethiopia. But I guess go ahead. I'd like to hear your reaction to that clip I just showed.
No, I think that's an important question. I think the weaponization of Black Lives Matter, as you point out there, the sort of African Lives Matter. I mean, it has two audiences. I mean, one, it has the audience in Africa of other nations who have consistently criticized the United States over the years for not caring at all about Africa, except to the extent they could destroy it and rob it of its wealth and its resources. So to some degree, that is some of the audience there. I think in a much bigger way, the real audience is China and Russia. Because since we're talking about UN Security Council action against Ethiopia, which is a country that's very close with China, and by the way, has been for many years, even during the latter half of the TPLF. And Russia is not really that involved in Ethiopia or that close to them, but nevertheless, based on what we know about their historic positions at the Security Council, could be very likely to step into a place and maybe block some form of sanctions or other form of action as a unilateral action, and so on and so forth. And I don't want to get into that, but I think that what the United States is really trying to do is set up a space by which anyone blocking anything they're saying should be done in the Security Council could be portrayed as racist. And that if you don't want to do anything about this, it shows that you don't really care about Africa, you don't really care about African lives. And of course, as it concerns China, this is the #1 allegation of the United States towards China, that they're just there to exploit Africa, which seems like an unbelievable statement for the United States or any to be making. I mean, really? Or the UK or France even more so. But I think that's really who the main audience for that was. And I think that it's on its face absurd. I mean, it's amazing to me that African lives don't seem to matter at all when it's the brutal regime of, say, Nigeria shooting people down, using their air force to destroy whole villages. There's just gruesome stories, of people being gunned down from helicopters, pilots of which, by the way, were trained by the United Kingdom, and these, completely absurd counterterrorism, so-called counterterrorism maneuvers. We see the same thing in Mali, by the way, where the government actually fell because the military backed by the United States was not only so inept in actually dealing with the conflict there, but they themselves had such a reputation for being equally as brutal as any of the forces that they were alleged to be fighting. I mean, where are the African lives that matter right now in Swaziland, Eswatini, where they're having these massive protests that are being brutally repressed by an absolute monarch who has total support historically from the United States? I mean, we could keep going over some amount of time, but it really is just shocking to even think that you could be bold enough to use that framing when, in fact, the United States right now contemporarily has been, over the history of the past 30 or 40 years, has been backing some of the most brutal regimes in the African continent that didn't care about anybody's life. who was under their so-called citizenship, their so-called aegis, and was brutally treating them, including in Ethiopia. So I think it really is as a propaganda measure that was aimed at China in particular, to a lesser extent Russia, and I think to some degree a message to Africans trying to say, oh, we really are all about this, and so on and so forth. But to take one step further in terms of the actual content of what she's saying, I mean, you know, it's so one-sided, it's unbelievable. I mean, you know, you have a unilateral ceasefire declared by the Ethiopian government. You've got the United Nations saying, okay, well, we've talked to them and they're going to start letting aid in. But you have the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, who's perversely changed the name of their military to the Tigrayan Defense Forces, who have now expanded the conflict. And they've actually gone on the offensive. And the only thing that that is likely to do is make it harder for humanitarian aid to get into the region. But yet until somehow there isn't any major condemnation of them from the United States. Now, there's some coming from some of the people, you know, the so-called humanitarian community, the human rights organizations, many of which have been all in on criticizing only the Ethiopian government.
Right.
And even now, many of them are starting to say, well, both sides need to be looked into. I mean, you look at just the issue of humanitarian aid, that's been a big issue in the media. Oh, these bridges are getting blown up. But even Human Rights Watch, who's been heavily criticizing the Ethiopian government, has actually said both sides are probably responsible for blowing up bridges. Now, I don't know the truth, I'm not there, but that sounds generally right when you know anything about war. But yet and still, that's not pointed out. Amnesty International, also been aggressively criticizing the Ethiopian government, noted that hundreds of people were massacred by the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front in a place called Maikadra. Never mentioned at all, never brought up in any way, shape, or form. So the whole idea that this is about showing African lives matter, that it's, you know, this regime that is refusing to do anything is extremely one-sided. And again, I'm not here to give unfettered, whatever praise to the Ethiopian government. This is a war in a country that's seen a lot of brutal wars and where a lot of the people involved have been involved in a lot of things. And I don't want to take away from anyone's particular story of any atrocity that was done to them or done to their family members or anything like that. But the reality is both sides, at the very least, both sides are doing something here. And only one side is actually being criticized for it. And the other side is being 100% demonized. And the one thing we know about the other side is that they, well, at least when it comes to Eritreans, that they are hated by the United States and are hated by U.S. imperialism. And that Ethiopia seems to have become, out of the blue in a way, some oppositional force that the U.S. has something against, seems to hold something against in terms of the way they're acting in this conflict. And so you really have to take one step back and look at that statement and say, this statement is political over and above anything else. And it's designed to put America's geopolitical opponents at the Security Council in a tough position. And it's designed to give aid and comfort to the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front and to create an international narrative that puts all of the onus on the Ethiopian military, despite the fact they didn't even start the war. And despite the fact they've been the only people to pull back, the Eritreans have also pulled back. And in the context of a unilateral ceasefire where both sides, the Eritreans and the Ethiopians, have pulled back, and the Ethiopians have, by the admission of the UN, started letting in more aid. And you can see that because look at the pictures of the Tigrayan leaders in these World Food Program trucks, you know? So that's also true. And by the way, the Tigrayans said, if there's no aid, we're going to open our own humanitarian corridor vis-a-vis the military to Sudan. So that hasn't happened. So that must mean that the Ethiopians are bringing in the aid. But yet and still, you have the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. You know, I mean, they claim these are disputed areas, but taking it into the Amhara region, taking it into the Oromia region. And we also know that there has been accusations of heavy shelling by the TPLF in these offensives that they've been doing in just the recent days in which we were talking about. And this shelling is also something that the Tigrayans have been accused by Human Rights Watch and others of doing indiscriminately and committing human rights abuses. But despite the fact that it's in the same report, the Western media only reports about the Ethiopian government part of it, not the other part of it. And I think that all of that coming together shows that the statement by Linda Thomas Greenfield, I believe, who's the UN ambassador for the United States, is totally one-sided, totally political, and completely designed to help push forward the outcome they seem to want, which is negotiations between the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front and the government of Abiy Ahmed. And since we know the negotiating position of the TPLF is for them to be the rulers of that region, that seems to be the only way that can actually happen in a real way, which would mean that this longtime, you know, very close ally of the United States would then, after being marginalized by its own people through a war that they started, be back in the center of the political conversation in Ethiopia and determining to some degree what the future policies of that country are going to be. So really the root of this conflict is the TPLF, which again was extremely brutal, extremely corrupt. Everything that the Ethiopian government is being accused of and the Eritrean government is being accused of, there is a long list and a long history of well-documented atrocities of just those types by the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. It was so bad that they themselves were marginalized by their own allies and the people of the country. So will they be able to play a role in the leadership of the country despite all that, or will they not be able to? And they seem determined to put themselves in the center of the conflict by force of arms if necessary, regardless of any other factor.
And, you know, just what you described reminds me so much of other conflicts in terms of the sort of just reporting on one side and, of course, demonizing the other completely when it's so much more gray than that. And that goes into the sort of disinformation around this issue. Simon Tesfamariam, who we had on our Breakthrough News live stream, which everyone should tune into every Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern, the Freedom Side, hosted by Eugene and me. He wrote a lengthy and meticulous report for the New Africa Institute about the disinformation surrounding the situation in Tigray. And he warned that imperialist powers are playing a role in promoting this kind of false narrative or one-sided narrative to push for intervention, to push for responsibility to protect, which, of course, is a doctrine where atrocities are just so bad somewhere, so bad that the bigger powers determine that this country no longer has sovereignty and we must go in and intervene militarily. And almost as if to prove his point, he was attacked by the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Lab. And for those who don't know, the Atlantic Council is a Washington, D.C. pro-war think tank funded by many, many, many different organizations and companies, including the State Department, NATO, every major weapons company you can imagine, Gulf state governments, and on and on and on. And they also advise, by the way, social media companies like Twitter and Facebook on what constitutes disinformation, which, of course, is always anything that challenges the U.S. government's narrative. So anyways, to me, it was extremely suspicious to see the Atlantic Council come after Simon's piece, which, that makes it, you have to wonder, right? I guess my question for you, Eugene, is, what do you make of the resources that seem to be put into pushing this interventionist narrative by a lot of the same places who pushed for war in places like Syria and Libya, pushed for intervention in places like Venezuela, because there does seem to be a kind of regime change network in place to push for intervention. And I recognize a lot of the same patterns I saw with these other wars, especially also, you have exiles coming out and giving interviews. So what do you make of all this?
I agree with you. I find it to be extremely suspicious. I mean, when the people who have supported every single disastrous intervention in the past 30 years are saying that any criticism of the TPLF is just disinformation. And, when you read the report by the New Africa Institute, and the thing that people are really taking it to task for is they're saying, well, they're using fact-checking tropes to cover up an atrocity. I don't know what a fact-checking trope is. Either you're checking the facts or you're not checking the facts. And I think that in and of itself is notable, that rather than sort of take apart the report sort of piece by piece, they're just sort of saying by the very act of fact-checking, they're just trying to, whitewash it, which, having read the report, doesn't really seem to be the case to me. Certainly having listened to Simon on our show, at multiple points, he actually laid out quite clearly that he isn't alleging that there is not suffering happening in Tigray and so on and so forth. But what the report was trying to lay out is that many of the claims that have been made, that have been very prominent in the Western media, have not been that well sourced. That there are also other things that have been totally omitted, especially around the issue of the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front history, their own history of atrocities, in terms of their own recent history of well before this war, or several in the months leading up to this war, seemingly setting the stage for that, and then starting the war in and of themselves, and then also atrocities committed by them being totally ignored and totally whitewashed. And I think that anyone who wanted to have an even hand would be pointing out that this is in fact the case. I mean, many forces who have been criticizing the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front recently, for instance, have been raising issues about children being used by the so-called Tigrayan Defense Forces in the conflict. Now, I'm not there. I don't know if there's children being used, but certainly that's against the rules of war. I've seen a number of photos that have been produced that seem to at least speak to this. And you would think that would at least be a topic of discussion. But the fact that it's not a topic of discussion, that no one's even really dealing with it, that it isn't really even taken that seriously, to me lets you know that there's really only an interest in looking at one side of these things. And the very fact that, again, as we said, people who've never met a regime change operation that they didn't like, no matter how disastrous the history have been, is saying, well, you can't question at all what's going on with the TPLF. Even when Amnesty International, which is certainly not, you know, some radical revolutionary entity, you know what I mean, is saying, yeah, they've committed some atrocities. When you've got Human Rights Watch saying, yeah, it looks like they committed some atrocities. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, people who are definitely criticizing the Ethiopian government, yet it doesn't really filter down. It raises a lot of questions. Why would it be that the Atlantic Council feels so the need to attack this report that's really just asking people to think critically about what's going on, to check the sources about what's happening and what's doing it? To me, to attack something like that, and to attack it, by the way, as only Eritrean government propaganda, as fact-checking tropes, as whatever, is exactly the type of thing you want to do when you want to completely dismiss any conversation around what's really going on because you want to create a narrative. And it seems very clear to me that there is a very strong attempt, certainly by the Friends of the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front all around the world, of which there are many, by the opponents of the Eritrean regime, who also live in different places around the world, who have a clear stake in wanting to create this narrative, to create the narrative that it's black hats, white hats, that the Eritreans and the Ethiopians are evil, evil devils, and they can never do anything right, and that the TPLF are the great, beautiful freedom fighters who can never do anything wrong. Now, no one with any knowledge of this situation would ever present it that black and white unless they were trying to push an agenda forward. Even if you want to be highly critical of the Ethiopian government, if you want to be highly critical of the Eritrean government, you would never present it in such a one-sided fashion as this, and the way it's been presented by those who are criticizing that report, who are criticizing the Atlantic Council and these others who are aggressively, you know, saying they should, you know, sanction and do whatever to the Ethiopian government. It would never be pushed in that way unless you were trying to make sure that there's a black hats, white hats narrative to help push forward policies of regime change in Ethiopia, or at least to push forward the TPLF agenda, which is to get back in the game, despite the fact that most of the people in the country seem to have not wanted that to take place.
No, that's a very well said. And I know we've been going for a while. I just have a few more questions for you here. And I think one question I think a lot of people would love to hear an answer to from someone who's knowledgeable about this is, you know, Eritrea is perhaps one of the most demonized and sanctioned African countries. You know, why is that? Because we hear they're, you know, a human rights abuser. But then I think to myself, but who isn't? And plenty of America's allies are, you know, you mentioned some of them earlier, are very good at abusing human rights. Yeah. So why is Eritrea so heavily demonized, more so than any other repressive country on the continent? And that said, what was their role in this fight?
You know, I think that's an important note. I mean, you know, to raise this issue of the U.S. is opposed to people for human. I mean, just look at the region. I mean, look at Egypt. You know, I mean, there's a scandal a couple of years ago in Egypt, you know, with the nightly news where there was some controversial issue and someone leaked the recording of the state media people telling the nightly news people exactly what to say word for word, not to mention the tens of thousands of political prisoners, the completely absurd executions that happened with no evidence at all, the torture that is widespread and well known. All of this is well known. I think the real issue between the U.S. and Eritrea is based on the fact that Eritrea it's an independent country. There are a lot of things that can be said about Eritrea in a lot of ways, about the history of the country. But I think at the end of the day, what's important and what's crucial for people to understand is they aren't a puppet client regime. Whatever position they may take at this or that time, good, bad, or indifferent, is a position they are taking. And it's well known for having a very strong ruling party that, you know, has some people don't like it and have left the country, and others, many people do support it. You know, they had a government that for years was, you know, more socialistic in terms of its economic policies. I don't know if that was really the reason that they were, I mean, you know, there was socialism in Ethiopia too, but they were bitter enemies, right? And so, the way the U.S. treated Eritrea then and Ethiopia then is a little bit different. But I say that to say that I don't think you could really say the Eritreans are a puppet of any country or a client of any country. They have an independent mindset and an independent mentality in terms of what they do. Again, whether you label that good, bad, or indifferent, and I think that is dangerous to the United States. I mean, you look at I gave the Somali example of the Islamic Courts Union. I mean, many of the most prominent figures in the Islamic Courts Union were prominent figures in the transitional federal government that overtook it when the US and Ethiopia invaded the country and destabilized it, right? So it wasn't that these were all people the US hated, but in and of itself, they didn't think they could control all the people. And that for them was dangerous. A unified, independent government in a crucial geostrategic area. And we see this again and again. You look at Iran. I mean, Iran certainly is not a country with a history of looking to destroy the United States. I mean, certainly we know in the 1980s, you know, they were to some degree targeted by the United States, but so was Iraq when they were pitting them against one another. But, you know, they were open to discussions. They were open to talks. They're still open to discussions and talks. And yet and still they're aggressively demonized for being open to working with the United States. But that's because it's not about being open to working with someone. It's not about wanting to have good relationships with the West. It's about whether or not you're going to be a total client state. So if you're Saudi Arabia, do whatever you want to do. Abuse whoever, imprison whoever, cut off as many heads as you want to cut off because they don't have an independent foreign policy. But Iran, which says we want to be independent, we want to do business with everybody, we want to build up our economy to the best degree we can, well, we must destroy them because that destroys U.S. total neocolonial control of the region. And I think a country like Eritrea in a crucial geopolitical area it's not really a good look for the United States to have someone who can make their own decisions there. And not only can make their own decisions, but is willing to do things that might anger the West. And I think certainly that's what we see in Somalia. And that's absolutely why the New York Times and others have all this stuff leaked to them about the role of Eritrea in Somalia. Oh, it's Eritrea and the UAE that are backing this anti-democratic government in Somalia. Well, where are they getting that from? We know where they're getting that from. They're getting it from the United States. So ultimately, at the end of the day, I think that's the root of the conflict. Not that they haven't worked together, not that they haven't had, you know, unity at different moments, not that there haven't been ups and downs in that relationship, but that at the end of the day, they don't think they can fully control them. And I think this is a key example of that because Eritrea, who had made the peace deal with Ethiopia, historic, it's hard to really understand. This is a historic peace deal between these two countries that have fought multiple wars between one another. It's been extraordinarily brutal over the years. You know, in the 80s, East Germany actually did 5 or 6 different rounds trying to bring the two sides together. Never really worked out. Deeply rooted divisions. So this is a big peace deal. And so not only did they have the big peace deal, but when the TPLF started a war, and it seemingly seems to be attempting to at least raise the specter of causing a full-on civil war and causing the country to unravel in order to get to a level of negotiations to bring them to some level of power back, the fact that Eritrea was willing to block with Abiy Ahmed to try to defeat that, and by the way, they had been shelled and attacked themselves, but I don't think it's just about that. I think that they saw what was happening and they didn't like the vision for the broader region, and of course had their own history of seeing the brutality of the TPLF forces up close, right? Because they'd fought several wars. They were willing to come together, and that was a sign that they were willing to go against what almost certainly would be perceived as against Western interests. Maybe at the beginning you couldn't tell that, but certainly now you can see that the West seems to be totally supporting the TPLF. And I think that showed that in Somalia and Ethiopia, Eritrea is willing to be independent just like they have for some time, and that in and of itself has made them a target.
Now, speaking of some of these other countries you mentioned, like Somalia, I think Sudan came up at one point earlier, but of course, Ethiopia is borders many countries. So I'm curious, moving forward, what might happen if this fight continues? What is the danger of this conflict continuing? Can it spill over into other areas? We already know there's actually refugees spilling into Sudan. And like you mentioned, the TPLF is basically threatening to make this conflict even bigger, especially when it comes to Eritrea. So what's the danger of this conflict going forward?
I think it's just what you said. I mean, certainly the TPLF has already threatened to invade Eritrea. And so that could potentially happen. And of course, shades of past wars that have happened there. Certainly Sudan is so let me start with Ethiopia is the better way to start here. I think that this really raises the possibility of the country totally unraveling. And, I think that my personal feeling is I don't know how likely that is, but we've already seen in Oromo, in the Oromia region, there are armed forces that maybe originally thought, okay, Abiy Ahmed, he's, from our people, we're the same people, this could work. They don't seem like it could. They maybe feel a little bit different. There are other armed forces that are there, and the context of an increased TPLF offensive means that whether they're allied with the TPLF or not, anybody who wants to take a shot at the Ethiopian government for whatever reason is going to be more likely to do it because they have more of a chance to succeed, right? When they're tied down in other places, which means that things could slip away into a civil war. You know, it could also slip away into infighting in many of these different ethnic areas. Like I said, I'm not trying to harp on the Oromo people, but that was one of the areas where there have been major insurgencies over the years. But then you also read today that the TPLF is attacking an Oromia militia that is allied with the government there. So you could see even in just that region alone that there could be people fighting amongst themselves over what the direction of the country should be. And it certainly could spill over into Sudan. You know, to some degree, it already has. There have been some border conflicts during this between Sudan and Ethiopia over accusations that different forces from Ethiopia have come into Sudan and seized some territory. Ethiopia denies that. Sudan said it definitely was happening. It's unclear what the relationship is between the Sudan and TPLF. And there's a long, complicated history between Ethiopia and Sudan and what's now South Sudan, and it, you know, well back into the 1980s, especially. I don't want to get too deep into it, but you know, during the Derg regime, where Ethiopia was socialist and allied with the Soviet Union, and Sudan was reactionary and allied with the West, there was a big support of Ethiopia for John Garang and others that would later change in South Sudan, and what at that point was probably a relatively progressive movement. And there have been back and forth with that several different times. But nevertheless, they do border each other. But the Sudanese government is 100% against the Ethiopian government vis-a-vis the issue of the dam. And, you know, both Sudan and Egypt keep saying that there's no chance they're going to go to war with Ethiopia over the dam. They're saying never going to happen. We're going to work it out. But I mean, not that long ago, just a few months ago, they had a set of military exercises called Protectors of the Nile, I believe. So what else does that mean other than, you know, since the dam affects the Nile headwaters in Ethiopia, what else could that possibly mean than potentially going to war with Ethiopia? And so you've already had these border conflicts, and it could possibly be a situation where the TPLF even invites some of these forces in, or just people looking to take advantage of the situation with the government they don't like being relatively weak. They may try to make some moves. So you could have a multi-way fight that could break down here. And I think that's the fear of many people who are followers of the country, that really the whole Horn of Africa could become engulfed in all sorts of different conflicts and multiple different sides that certainly could leach into the regional functionality. And the more that starts to collapse, the more the regional situation becomes a bigger issue, and the more international intervention becomes an issue. And I think the possibility of a real unraveling is not small, because like I said, there are a lot of complicated issues inside of Ethiopia with long issues of marginalization. There are important issues of economic development that also cut against this. There are crucial issues of sort of regional geopolitics. So yeah, it has all the ingredients for something that could collapse into a very, very, very bad, very dangerous, very destructive region-wide conflict. Now, that being said, the election that did take place in some regions, not in others, there was big support for Abiy Ahmed. And I actually, believe it or not, have not seen many claims, even from critics of Abiy Ahmed, that was some fake election. I've actually seen most places, even from his critics, saying that, well, it might be incomplete, it doesn't tell the whole story, but he does have a lot of support. So, I mean, that in some ways speaks to that fact. The Amhara region, which is representative of the Amhara people, who traditionally were the family of the royal family, and really an ethnicity that was because of that given a lot more opportunities than others, and seen as sort of an oppressor nation by many of these other nations for many years. You know, they seem to be working with Abiy Ahmed, which may mean that he is having more success in pushing more of a multinational vision where people aren't marginalized. And I think that in and of itself speaks to the fact that there is a centrifugal force here that maybe will keep things from totally falling apart. But I do think that it's a big danger. But I also think that the TPLF, which has threatened to invade Eritrea but has not, which has threatened to invade the Amhara region but is mainly skirmishing around Oromia, I think that they are not 100% confident that if they really push this into other regions that they will succeed. And because of their long history, and in some of these places, including the Oromo state, very brutal history, could actually cause a reaction against them and could lead to them losing and more of a unity around Abiy Ahmed's government as well. So I think when you look at their recent moves, it's offensive, but it's a little more ginger than what they had been suggesting they might do in the wake of the unilateral ceasefire, when it seemed like they were going to launch a full-on offensive into multiple different areas. It seems that they maybe aren't willing to go that far because they know they won't be able to bring a lot of support, and it could backfire on them in terms of strengthening Abiy Ahmed rather than weakening him. So it's a dangerous situation, and it's a very tough situation to predict because there are a lot of different fault lines that are all at play here.
Yeah, that's what's so frightening is there's so many different interests that actually have a stake in maybe this going, this becoming more violent. But we'll have to wait and see. In the meantime, what I think is a good last question is, we as Americans, we always want to have a position on every conflict, and especially as leftists, right, as well, we want to find the side that is just and identify the cause we should be supporting and try to integrate every conflict into our paradigms. And it's definitely suspicious, when the U.S. seems to be taking a side. So all that said, how should we look at this conflict in Ethiopia as leftists in the U.S.? I know it's a hard question, but
it's a hard question, but it's an important question. But I think vis-a-vis us in the United States, we should look at it in the way we look at all other conflicts, which is, the U.S. imperialist agenda is the root of pretty much all major conflict anywhere on earth. There are all sorts of other intervening agendas, and some people would say, oh, I'm flattening it out, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. But the United States just decides we're going to pick winners and losers in every single conflict, and they do everything possible to support who they want to be the winners and to demonize the people they want to be the losers. So it completely and totally eliminates all sense of agency from peoples around the world. It eliminates any real sense of self-determination for peoples around the world. I think the way we have to look at this conflict is, why is it that the United States is pushing a 100% one-sided agenda? And whatever else is happening there on the ground, there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is because they're pushing the side who for years have been willing to hold their writ in the region totally uncritically, despite the fact that there are many, many terrible things happening. And in that context, the U.S. should not be supporting the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. It should not be going out of its way to try to give aid and comfort to these individuals. And I think that we need to stay focused on that. We are here in Americans. We can affect, theoretically, the U.S. government. And I think what we should be doing in terms of this is, I don't think we need to be making grand statements necessarily about who's doing what and, who's the black hat and who's the white hat. But I think we can make a very clear statement that the United States is doing nothing other than inflaming the conflict by preventing the truth about what's actually going on from being presented in a way that people can understand, and that doesn't give aid and comfort to the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front to continue pushing their atrocities and their warlike activities under the guise of it being great, good, and humanitarian, which is primarily coming from the U.S. government. I mean, yes, it's the media, but if the U.S. government was not presenting it in this way, the media would be presenting it in a different way. Right. That's how it really works. And I think the reality of the situation is, here in the United States, I think people who think that U.S. imperialism has a malign agenda abroad and that it's desire to be the world police to control every region, especially geostrategic ones, is a bad policy, is a fallacy, is a folly, is a fallacy, is negative. That then really our duty is to criticize that U.S. positioning, to criticize the U.S. flattening out of the conflict, to criticize the U.S. using this conflict for geostrategic leverage, as we talked about with the African Lives Matter thing and the overall campaign against China, and to be pushing for the United States to really allow Ethiopians to solve this amongst themselves, allow it to be resolved within the region without that thumb on the scale that the U.S. imperialists always feel like they want to do in every single conflict, in which in almost every single case just metastasizes the conflict and makes it worse.
Very well said. Eugene Puryear, our very own breakthrough news journalist, Eugene Puryear. I'm sure that nobody needs to hear this, but just in case, where can everybody follow your work?
Well, you can certainly follow the things we do at BT Newsroom across all your social media platforms. You can listen to the podcast, The Punch Out, which we release across our social media platforms at 5 p.m. Eastern. Anywhere you listen to podcasts, Spotify, Apple Music, so on and so forth. You can follow me personally at Eugene Puryear. And yeah, that probably should do it. If you're following Breakthrough News, you'll be able to follow me. So make that your #1 follow.
Thank you so much, Eugene, for coming on and breaking this all down for us.
Thank you so much for having me.